I'm Bob Perry. I'm Vice President for Programs here at the Corporate Council on Africa. I see a few members from CCA in the group, so for those who primarily have a SID relationship, let me just tell you a little bit about CCA's background so you know who your hosts are. CCA was created in 1993 by some folks coming out of the first Bush administration and recognizing in terms of dealing with Africa. They had the public policy side of it, but they thought they needed some better coordination with the business community invested in Africa. So people from the administration working with people from the business sector got together and created CCA with some support in terms of a grant from USAID. And it's grown from about 10, 15 members at that time to about 160 to 170 now. Our membership is very diverse, covering about 18 different commercial sectors. There's a lot on the extractive side, as you would expect, but also in terms of classification, about 50% of our members are small business using U.S. government categories, and maybe about 25 mid-size, and the other balance being the real global multinational players. We may be better known for some of the conferences we do. Every 2 years we do a U.S.-Africa Business Summit. Our next one will be the first week of October this year. And we've been doing that since 1997. Also this year we're doing another one that we have done in the past, is the Private Sector AGOA Forum. That's going to be held in Lusaka, Zambia, the first week of June. And then at the end of March, a sort of a new addition to our activities, we're going to do an international partnership conference in Tenerife, Canary Islands, Spain. Canary Islands are not well known. They say that they have a close identity to Africa because of their geographic location, about 70 kilometers off the coast of Mauritania. They do a lot of trade with countries from Morocco down through about Liberia. But the special nature of this is we're going to reach out to partner business associations in Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, that we have existing relationships with, as well as the EFCAM, which represents the European Business Associations focused on Africa, the Canadian Council on Africa, FICCI from the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce, JETRO from Japan, to talk about our mutual interests in investing in Africa and how we can collaborate better with each other. So we're looking forward to that. That's March 29 to April 1 in Tenerife. It's on our website. Okay, let's turn to today's program, which is maybe a little bit more like what we do for other events in terms of talking about individual countries, or particular thematic topics. Cote d'Ivoire is certainly the topic du jour, more or less, because of crisis there. So our speakers are Ambassador Aubrey Hooks. Aubrey has served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Cote d'Ivoire, most recently, 2004 to 2007. We met as he was coming out of Bangui, Central African Republic, at the end of 1998, just before I was going in as U.S. Ambassador there. And I think they picked him for that because he knew that tough neighborhood very well, and it was tough. At that time, there was a peacekeeping mission there that had been put together under sort of French guidance that was then converted to a UN mission, Blue Helmet mission. Ivorian troops were part of that mission. And if you understand the UN system, the UN pays national governments for their troop support when there are crises, and the governments are responsible for paying the troops. Well, there was a little problem. Ivorians didn't quite live up to their part with the troops, and when they got home, they started turmoil. which then fed into the coup, and then things kind of evolved from there. Ambassador Hooks has got a long time experience in Africa in addition to the countries I just mentioned, and he's now working as an advisor to some number of companies investing in Cote d'Ivoire. So we're certainly looking forward to his comments. He knows the key political players intimately. I'm sure he's had a chance to talk frequently to them and try to persuade them of the national good while he was there. Greg Simpkins has a lot of experience both in foundation world and as well as the congressional staff, professional staff, the House Foreign Relations Committee, looking at issues focused on Africa over a period of about 10 years. And then he's also, during that 10 years, AGOA was a key issue to Africa Growth and Opportunities Act in terms of U.S. policy reaching out to try to promote trade as well as investment in Africa. And he can bring and share with us his perspective on how Congress looks at Africa in terms of everything they look at in international relations, how you mobilize support, and how you deal with crises such as the one in terms of maintaining interest and focusing attention on issues so that you keep the public policy engaged with Africa, as well as how you integrate business interests to promote stability.
You didn't mention I used to work here at CCA.
That's right. Some time back. Thank you.
Some time back.
Thank you. Thank
In
you.
the distant past.
Yeah. And Renard Jackson, who's President and CEO of Jackson and Associates, is going to be our moderator. He has an experience in public policy moderating, and he will challenge us today to look at the issues here. He has done work with both the Nixon administration and the current Obama administration in both fostering dialogue on issues of public policy. So at this point, I think I'll turn it over to you. Take the lead.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Mr. Ambassador. And thank you guys for coming. Before we get started, I definitely want to give a big thank to Christy Reagan and Stacy Whittle. Without these hard-working women, this program would not be here, and we're going to talk about that near the end of the program. But thank you guys. I want to make sure I get that out of the way publicly, because they are two of the hardest working people in D.C. Obama has nothing on these two. Before I get started, I want to ask my audience a question. Right after the election, the POTUS called President Gbagbo, and of course we all know that President Gbagbo rebuffed the phone call. And since then, the AU, the EU, ECOWAS, the IMF have all weighed in on that. Now, here's the question. Raise your hand if you understood what I just said. Those who raise your hand have been in D.C. too long. Only in D.C. can we talk with alphabet soup and people understand each other. One of the things I don't want to happen today is we're going to have a global audience, because this has been taped and it's going to be streamed on the internet, and probably some other media outlets going to pick it up. So my challenge to the panelists is, if I use the moderator's prerogative and interrupt you to define some of the alphabet that we throw around because we all are so used to talking to each other, remember that not everyone who's going to watch this is an insider and understands all this alphabet soup we talk in. So that's wanted to get that out. Now, my job as moderator is to kind of keep the conversation flowing, and we're going to open it up to the audience shortly. But I want this to be a conversation piece, and I don't want this to be an academic exercise or a theoretical exercise. The people I have here on this panel, they are all functional experts, not only in the country, but on the continent in general. So you all have an opportunity to get some valuable insight and information that will stand up against any other organization. And so I definitely want to give thanks to SID and CCA. There I go doing it. Corporate Council of the African Society for International Development for hosting this event. And so what I want to do is to start from about 30,000 feet, and then we're going to work our way down. And so to my panelists, I want you all to pretend, just for the sake of this panel, and I know this is going to be easy for you all to imagine, that I'm President Obama. Even though I think I look a lot better, but that's up to him and Michelle to determine that. But what I want to do is to pretend like I'm the president, and I've convened you guys to get your expert knowledge on what I as president should do about the issue facing Cote d'Ivoire. And so my first question will be to you, Ambassador Hooks. As president, tell me why American and why my foreign policy team should care about what's going on in Ivory Coast, and what, if any, is their strategic value to the U.S. foreign policy?
Thank you. And yeah, I love that question, because I think it's one that we have to ask ourselves when we work out in the field. What does this country mean to the United States, and how do you get attention back in Washington? First of all, I think Ivory Coast is probably the most important Francophone country in Africa. It's always been a hub. It's been a regional hub in terms of French policy focused in Africa. Houphouët-Boigny for a long time played the role of the elder statesman of the sort of the Francophone community. What happens in Ivory Coast has an impact on the rest of the country. Many of the regional organizations in West Africa, particularly those that are Francophone oriented, but not just those, were centered in Abidjan. The African Development Bank was an example of that. Other organizations as well were focused in Ivory Coast, because this was the largest, most important Francophone country at the time. So I think that that is something that is very, very important. Secondly, I think there's another factor. There's a large number of immigrants from various countries that live in Ivory Coast. It's difficult to know exactly how large the percentage is, but it's probably 40% of the population. Therefore, this would have an impact. Whatever happens in Ivory Coast would have an impact on those countries. Many of the countries use the ports of Ivory Coast as their access to the world and to the sea. Burkina Faso, Mali, and other countries. So I think it's an extremely important country, and whatever happens in Ivory Coast has an impact on the rest of the region. And that's why I think it's important to the United States, because after all, we're looking for stability in the region and hopefully prosperity. And in order to obtain those objectives, Ivory Coast has to be a central part of that policy.
Okay, thank you. To Greg, here's my question for you. How did, in brief, how did Ivory Coast get to this point where it is today relative to the post-election controversy?
Well, you know, actually, we were talking earlier, and I said in looking back over my notes and looking back over articles from the past, Ivory Coast has been in a crisis at one level or another for a couple of decades. This is really nothing new. It's just that we here in America haven't paid as much attention to that, because Ivory Coast never dropped out of the top 10 African trading partners. We always bought and sold goods, even during the Civil War. So there was not that kind of dislocation. The war, and of course Ambassador Hooks could give more detail on it. It wasn't the kind of war as you saw in Sudan or Liberia. It was largely skirmishes, a riot here or there, things happening sporadically. So without that large-scale massacre, we here didn't think it was that critical. I know working on the Hill twice for the Africa Subcommittee, we never put it at the head of all of the countries that we were concerned with. We obviously were concerned with Sudan, Somalia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Zimbabwe. Cote d'Ivoire was always something, oh yeah, we'll get to that later. Oh yeah, that has to be addressed. And we visited the country, but we didn't really try and address what was a long-standing crisis. You look at when Houphouët-Boigny was in power for about 33 years, I believe, you could call him a dictator, and I wouldn't dispute you. The thing was that all of these ethnic problems were submerged during his rule. And it was a stable country. It was always a good trading partner, a good partner in terms of global diplomacy in concert with the United States in Africa. And after he died, the whole concept of ivoirité, of Ivorianness, kind of morphed into something more destructive. During his time, I believe it more referred to the culture of Ivory Coast, to put forward that other countries, Senegal and others, were putting forward theories of their culture being one that should survive colonialism. Now, after he died, Bédier, who took over right after he died, kind of turned it to more those who were born in Ivory Coast and those who were not. But you have to remember that Ivory Coast was part of the West African Federation under the French. So wherever you were, it was pretty much the same in that you were in territory controlled by France. So if one of your parents was born there and one was born in Ivory Coast, still you were born in French West Africa. But in order to get Alassane Ouattara disqualified from elections, it turned into more, well, he wasn't born, he wasn't, both his parents weren't Ivorian. He's not a real Ivorian. And that really took a very ugly turn as people in the North, mostly Muslim in the North, there were a lot of people who came from other parts of French West Africa, but it turned into something very xenophobic. And so that once you let the genie out of the bottle, it's kind of difficult to put it back. Now, as regards the elections, in the 95 elections, Henri Konan Bédier, who had become president after President Boigny died, after a power struggle with the then prime minister, who was Alassane Ouattara. He started to really push this. And there also were a lot of human rights violations under his rule. And in the 95 election, the opposition refused to compete because they said it wasn't a fair playing ground. He won that election. The 2000 election, by that time, Bédier had been overthrown. Gbagbo was now president. He won the 2000 elections, but again, the major opposition didn't run in that election. Now, back in the 1990s, I worked for the International Republican Institute doing training for political parties, training observers, both party observers and civil society observers. And there was kind of a craze during that time of opposition parties boycotting elections because they said that the environment for elections was not fair. And that's true. But they were expecting the international community to back them up. They didn't. And so what happened was you gave the dictator a free run. And in both these cases, men won who might not have won had the opposition been strong and had run against them. In 2005, the election never happened. It was supposed to. It didn't happen because of the unrest. Gbagbo had, I believe, instituted a state of emergency at one point. There were negotiations on elections, and these elections were postponed 6 times in 5 years for various reasons. The census wasn't done, voter registration wasn't done. The international community was very generous, I would say, in giving Gbagbo a pass on this. Now, we had the first round of elections in November. Or rather, October. Gbagbo had 38%, Ouattara had 32%. When they had the second round, Bédier threw his support to Ouattara, which I don't think Gbagbo expected. And at the end, 54% for Ouattara and 46% for Gbagbo. Well, of course, if you think that you're ahead, if you think you're going to win, of course you don't think that this is possible. There must be some trickery. But he'd been talking about voter registration problems and difficulties with the election for a long time before the election was actually held. So he was anticipating using some pretext or even some justification of some manipulation. So when the Election Commission certified the election, the Constitutional Commission almost immediately decertified the election in 7 different districts, ironically, all in the North for some reason. And I'm told that somewhere around 500,000 people were not, who had their votes disqualified. So that changed the results so that, according to them, Gbagbo was the winner. And that's how we got to this situation. It's been a long road. It isn't just something that happened overnight.
Right. Thanks, Greg. And we're going to get back to that in a little bit more detail. But Ambassador Perry, I want to shift with you to the business side. How has this post-election controversy impacted the business climate as far as U.S. companies investing in Ivory Coast, as well as those who are already invested? Are they looking at shifting their investment to other countries that are more stable? So what's the impact of this controversy on the business climate?
I think the business community primarily wants political stability, and when they go into a country and maybe even sometimes into a region. And I think that's particularly the case in Africa sometimes, where problems in one country frightens businesses from going into the region. Those who are there now, I think, are sort of hunkering down, watching everything that's at play and trying to mitigate their risk. But this is certainly not a situation that would encourage too much new investment going in under these conditions. I think that if you look back, there's expectation that things will be resolved in some way, and so people considering new investments will carefully analyze what's going on to try to figure out when things will be more suitable for going in and making new investments.
Now, for those who may not be as detailed on the ground there in Ivory Coast, what are the major industries from the U.S. that have a presence in Cote d'Ivoire?
I think you have in the agricultural sector the cocoa industry. Cote d'Ivoire is the largest producer and exporter of cocoa globally. Behind it comes, in terms of Africa, would be Ghana and Nigeria. And because of its infrastructure, it just sort of holds that investment. But I think you have now, in terms of a growing demand for cocoa globally, and so companies will probably look to other countries in terms of new production. That has already been occurring over the past decade as companies have invested more in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brazil.
Is that a zero-sum game there?
No.
Because of what's going on in Ivory Coast, they're pulling out?
I think that because of increased demand, because of rising economies and consumption of chocolate and cocoa products, the global demand for those products will increase. And so the companies are looking for other sources anyway. In terms of the short term, I think that they will look certainly more carefully about the next year or two in terms of where they're going to get their supply. Because most of, you know well, in terms of the internal transportation, this is harvest season for the main crop, and most of the crop is located between the coast and Yamoussoukro. So if most of the turmoil is primarily political discourse and sort of jockeying in the press, that farm to market movement can still continue. If it gets out of hand, then it will disrupt that. It will disadvantage the cocoa farmers in terms of their livelihoods, as well as have an impact on the global companies.
I think a couple of things we can add in terms of the business climate in the Ivory Coast. First of all, ever since the coup of December 1999, there have been various types of sanctions that have been applied against Ivory Coast, some automatic because of military coup. Secondly, because of the elections of the year 2000 that were never accepted as fully legitimate by the U.S. government and by other elements of the international community, those sanctions were never lifted. And it was hoped, therefore, that elections in 2005 would help to bring a degree of let's say, legitimacy that would allow those elections, those sanctions to be lifted. And unfortunately, as you have just pointed out, the elections were then postponed from 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, and finally 2010. And I think one of the things is that it was hoped that the elections of 2010 would be seen as credible and therefore would allow the lifting of these sanctions, which would have an enormous impact on the investment climate. Because ever since the year 2005, and there has been the view that there is, particularly in the business community, that a country that can't get to elections clearly has a fundamental problem, a very serious political problem. There was a great deal of concern about stability, and that's why I think there was so much hope that was placed in the elections of 2010. This was the hope of the Ivorian business community and of the international business community interested in investing there. There's a lot of interest But there was sort of sense, let's wait until the elections of 2010, and then we'll be able to go into Ivory Coast. And that's why I think these elections have been watched with a great deal of attention by the international community, and the disappointment that instead of opening up the door, let's say, to a new investment era, it has in a sense blocked it at least for the time being. Hopefully things will work out and that things will move forward, but it certainly has had a serious impact on the investment climate.
Right. So what I'm hearing from my esteemed national security team here as president is that one of the reasons we should care about Ivory Coast, Women's Valentine's Day is coming up, and if this is not solved, it may impact your ability to get candy from your significant other. So, but I want to shift Ambassador Hooks to the personality of the main characters in this drama here. And I called Ambassador Hooks about a week or two ago, and this is over the Christmas holiday. Goudet? Blake Goudet. I called him and said, Mr. Ambassador, Goudet just threatened that if Ouattara is not out of the hotel by Saturday, he's going to, bring his youth together, and they're just going to bum rush the hotel. I called Ambassador Hooks and said, why would he sell wolf tickets like that? I mean, there's no way he's going to do that. And Ambassador Hooks said, no, he was serious. I know. So I want you to go and give us an insight into the personality of some of the players. Goudet, the Minister of Youth, Sorrell, the Prime Minister, Ouattara, and Bob. To kind of take us into how some of their personalities are impacting the way this drama is being played out.
What is very interesting, of course, you've listed a long number of people there, so I'll be very brief about each one. First of all, I think President Gbagbo. Here is a natural politician. When he meets you, you're his best friend. You're the person that's most important to him. He's very people-oriented. And when he talks to people, he has a lot of personal charm. And that's why I think he's been successful as a politician. He tends, however, to get his information from talking to people, less reading. He doesn't read a great deal. He tends to talk to people. He meets, he gets up very late in the morning, but from the time he gets up until early hours of the morning, he is meeting with people. He tends to get his energy and his inspiration from talking to people. Now here's a man who has dreamed of being president of Ivory Coast for a long time, going back into the 1980s. He was the, let's say, principal voice of opposition to Houphouët-Boigny, more of a gadfly in those days, not taken all that seriously. And I think that's an important point, because in the year 2000, when General Gay at that time, who was president of the country, he of course found various ways to eliminate many of the principal candidates except for Laurent Gbagbo, and whom he hoped that he would therefore be able to have an easy victory over Laurent Gbagbo. Things went awry, and Gbagbo became president. President Gbagbo, he had dreamed this for a long period of time. He loves the adulation of the crowds. And therefore, when he became president under circumstances of 2000, he recognized that had circumstances been differently, he might not have had the chance that he had at that particular time. But once he became president, he, power is a very, very attractive drug in a sense, and he tended to grow on that. He began to see him, as, I think, more also as a little bit of a savior of Ivory Coast. He saw that he's holding the country together following the coup of 2002, and only he could sort of bring it back together. And he sort of has this mission that he wants to fulfill. He is also a very, very proud man. He's a very stubborn man. He comes from the western part of the country, where people are known for being somewhat tough, from the Bete ethnic group. And he, therefore, is not one to cut and run very easily. And we can see now he's being very, very tough in terms of dealing with the international community. He differs in this respect considerably from, let's say, the previous president, President Beki, who left very quickly in 1999. But President Gbagbo, he's a very tough individual. He relies a great deal upon street power. This is how he changed events in the year 2000. And he has relied more upon street power than actually upon the institutions of the state interestingly. We saw this in 2004, which of course now leads me to Charles Goudet. Now I think one of the points very interesting in terms of some of the main personalities, and for those of you who follow Ivory Coast, the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, current Prime Minister, one of the Prime Ministers is Mr. Sorrell. And Charles Blake Godet, of course, is now the Minister of Youth, and this name comes up because he's head of the Young Patriots. But if you look back in a little history, what's very interesting is that both of them were protégés of President Blackwell. He, in a sense, they were his les petits, his sons, so to speak, in the political context. He is the one who helped to form them. He is the one who founded the FESI student organization at the university, and both of these were his protégés that he helped along the way. And Soro became Secretary General of the FESI student group, followed by Blake Godet. They were very close friends at the time, worked very closely together. What was interesting, of course, is that when Soro was in the north and was head of the Force Nouvelle, the new forces, the rebel movement, if you wish to call it that, Blake Godet, of course, began to get make his own name at that particular time. Which, in a sense, you had an internal problem within FESI or FPI, the president's group, in that you had on the other side, led by one of the leaders of his student organization, and on his side, one of the successors. So I found that to be a very, very interesting phenomenon. And that's much more complicated than that, but I think that was an interesting way of looking at it. Soro is a very quiet individual. He is somewhat reserved, not your typical politician, very soft-spoken, and I think that he is primarily through his days as student leader, he was called upon to bring the political element to the rebel movement, which the military did not have. I think the fourth one I'd mention very quickly is Mr. Ouattara, whom I also met many, many times. He is representative more of the North. He's one whose nationality is oftentimes questioned because of his use of a passport from Burkina Faso in the past to come to study in the United States. He spent a lot of time in the United States here in Washington. He studied here. He also worked at the IMF. So he knows Washington quite well. He speaks English very, very well. And he feels, I have the impression that sometimes he feels more comfortable dealing with international financial institutions than he does, let's say, a mass meeting in somewhere in Ivory Coast. So he's very urbane, very sophisticated, speaks English very well. President Gbagbo is not as urbane, although he has studied in France and so on and so on. He tends to be a more populist, more popular figure in that sense.
Thank you. I was asked to, when you all are speaking, hold the mics up to you so people in the back can hear you better. Mr. Ambassador Perry, what role does personality play as an ambassador when you're interacting with foreign leaders? What is the role of personality?
I think personality is sort of central. You're going into a country, Ambassador Hooks has done it more times than I, and you have to establish a personal rapport with the head of state as well as with his key ministers, because many times power can be diffuse and you need to be able to approach more than one person. Sometimes it's the Minister of Finance, sometimes it's the head of the Armed Services who can have a countervailing view to the President. But if you do not have that personal relationship, it is difficult to have the President or whoever you are meeting with accept you as a messenger or as a confidant to be listened to and maybe someone whose advice he or she should accept. And so and that's true here in the U.S. in terms of power politics, and that's what you're talking about. And as ambassador, you're to represent the U.S. interest, but first you have to have that rapport so that you will be listened to.
Now, when you are ambassador in a country, how often are you in communication with, say, a president in the host country? Is it on a regular basis or just on a needed basis?
I would say it's on a sort of an ad hoc needed basis based upon your needs as ambassador as well as the president's needs. If the president does not see a need to meet with you, you don't get a meeting.
One thing I might add to that, and I see another ambassador here also, former ambassador to Nigeria and other places. Sorry, I need to pull this mic, sorry. I think one thing that's also very important to note that isn't oftentimes understood is the role of an American ambassador. is that you are one of the few people who has access to the president. That's number one. And you're one of the few people among those who have access who are not there to advance your own interest. But you're there as if you have an outside perspective. And sometimes you may be the only person who sees the president who can give him a view that his closest circle of advisors do not give to him.
Now, when you say give them, you're not talking about giving them the view of the U.S. and how they view his government. You're saying just kind of being an honest broker?
Correct. And now, obviously, you're there to advance U.S. interests. But oftentimes, the president, depending on your relationship with him, if he has confidence in you, will look to you as a source of information. Because clearly his own circle will try to give him information that makes them look good and advance their interests. They don't always give him a clear, unbiased view of the world. And that's where you can bring that in. And I might cite an example when I was in Congo and participating in the negotiations in Sun City. I spoke on a daily basis to President Kabila. And when I missed a day, he called me and said, "You didn't call me yesterday." Because he wanted to find out, in addition to his own team there, how I viewed the situation. And I think oftentimes if you have the confidence of the president, he appreciates what you can bring to him in that respect.
Now, is there ever a danger when you have those types of conversations with a head of state, is there a danger of them construing your observation for U.S. policy? And how do you minimize the opportunity for that to happen?
It will depend on the subject you're discussing, but I think you can make it very clear and always as to when you're advancing official U.S. policy and when you're talking to the president about issues that are important to him. And I think when you have a good relationship with the head of state, and I felt that I did both in Ivory Coast and in Congo, you discuss a wide range of issues. Many of them issues having to do with national politics, where the U.S. does not have a direct and important interest, but nevertheless the president wants to have your view as you look at it from the outside. You represent a very important voice in the international community. And in many countries in Africa, that's very, very important.
Greg, let me ask you, and I'd like to get the rest of you guys to weigh in. I think this is an opportunity for ECOWAS, the
Economic Community for
West African States. Wow. First mistake of the year. God, last year I didn't make any. I think ECOWAS has an opportunity to prove to the international community that Africa is maturing to the point where maybe, just maybe, Africa doesn't constantly need the EU and the US to come in and save the day for them. If ECOWAS can play a leading role in resolving this, however they resolve it, how do you think that will reverberate on the continent, number one? And then what has been the role of ECOWAS and what kind of grade would you give them thus far?
Well, thus far, I'd at least give them a B+, if not an A. I think that, however, they're in a tight situation because all of this talk about military intervention in Cote d'Ivoire is a little premature because the moving force in ECOMOG, which is, don't make me spell it out, it's the military arm of ECOWAS, depends largely on the Nigerians and also the Ghanaians. The Ghanaians have already said they're not going to be a part of that. The Nigerians are undergoing an election, which is very contested, so they are somewhat distracted, and if they were to send troops in now and there was a conflict and Nigerians were sent home in body bags, that wouldn't do very well for the candidates. So they're not likely to want to go in immediately, and if the Nigerians and the Ghanaians don't, then the others would be somewhat reluctant to do it either. I think that was a bit premature to suggest that they were going in right away. So to that extent, you're making a promise that you really can't keep, and that does reflect badly, or will reflect badly on ECOWAS. Politically speaking, I think that they've sent in presidents. The former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, was there. The Prime Minister of Kenya was there, and other heads of state and former heads of state have gone in. President Gbagbo just does not want to give in. Now, for a while, I thought he was holding out for what the international community usually does, which is say, well, it's a contested election, why don't you guys join in a government of national unity? And I would ask the panel and anyone here, can you tell me one place that a government of national unity has worked? Because really, often the example of the United States is used, and it's said, well, Republican presidents put Democrats in the cabinet. Democratic presidents put Republicans in the cabinet. However, they're not the person you just ran against in the election. They're not people who are going to run in the next election. You would never see McCain in an Obama administration. You certainly didn't see Kerry in the Bush administration. But what we do is force rivals together, and there's no way that can work. So he has said, President Gbagbo has said that he isn't really interested in a government of national unity, but surely he must know that the international community is not looking like they're going to back down. And what they're going to use is sanctions. The ECOWAS can certainly put on some sanctions. The UN has put on sanctions. That's pretty much what we have as a tool to work with. Because military intervention, I don't think is going to happen in the near future.
How would you
Can
grade?
can I follow up with one comment in reference to your question? What I think is very interesting and probably almost without precedence in Africa, and I think perhaps this is a sign of the maturing process that you mentioned, is you have the African Union, first of all, which took a very clear and straightforward position on this election. There are those, of course, who disagree with that, but the position was very clear. Secondly, ECOWAS also stepped in and also took a very, very straightforward position on this. What was, I think, very unusual is that they took a position against the sitting head of the state, which is almost unprecedented. Normally, there's ways of trying to avoid that, of condemning a current head of state. The fact that those organizations took a very public, a very fast and quick decision against President Gbagbo's decision or let's say his being sworn in, I think is something new in Africa, and I think perhaps is something we see more of in the future.
But does that go back to personality? Do people like President Gbagbo? And because from what I've been able to glean, his personality is one that rubs a lot of other leaders on the continent the wrong way. So have these internationals come out so swiftly because of a personality issue?
I don't think it's strictly personality. I think Africa is evolving, and I think this is part of what we see is that there is something that's new. It's very, very different without press, as I mentioned earlier. Now it's true that in terms of personalities, he has rubbed some leaders the wrong way. If you recall, some years ago, he put his foot in his mouth when he referred to President Bongo as a clown. Something he probably should not have said. But he does have some friends, Angola, for instance, with Dos Santos, and elsewhere on the continent there are some who have a certain, let's say, understanding of his position, and who have not been as vocal in speaking out. But it's true that overall he does not have a lot of friends on the continent. But what I think is it's much more than personality. This is a very political decision, and I think that this is something we need to take very careful note of.
Actually, if I could, you have to remember that the mandate for Gbagbo expired in 2005. So he's been president these last 5 years at the sufferance of the international community, including ECOWAS and the AU. Now, I think these leaders have just run out of patience with him. It's not a personality issue. He's postponed these elections over and over and over again and made promises that just weren't kept. And so I think he has no more benefit of the doubt. And that's really what's motivating the unity, which is remarkable among ECOWAS and the African Union.
Ambassador Perry, let's say tomorrow morning Ouattara is officially in the presidential palace and President Gbagbo has left by whatever circumstances. What is the business community saying when that happens amongst themselves?
I think they will still carefully watch the situation, because I think, as Ambassador Hooks noted, it's not just President Gbagbo. There are a group of supporters, and whether or not they gracefully accept the departure of President Gbagbo, and if you look at other situations in other countries when a president mandate has finally run out and it's time to move, many other countries will offer someone somewhere to live comfortably, but not the 1,000 people who supported him. And it's how they are reconciled into the political process that will make it possible for President Ouattara to have a successful administration. And that's going to take a lot of negotiation and mediation on the ground.
Do you anticipate once and should Ouattara does become president, do you anticipate any major changes politically or as far as the business climate, Cote d'Ivoire to the U.S., or you expect things to just kind of stay as they are?
I would not expect major changes. Probably maybe sanctions can be lifted over time as a sense of what he's doing will last in terms of opening the door from a U.S. policy point of view and dealing with a new administration there. In terms of individual business decisions, they will look at the type of policies that he introduces to see if they are considered fair, if he respects existing contracts. Those are the types of things I think that companies will look at.
Okay, I'm going to ask 3 other quick questions from my panel, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. And when we come to you, audience, no speeches. That's my job. So I want you all to quickly answer this question. What has the media fairly covered this? And that's the first question. The part B to that question is, how do you think the personalities in this drama have utilized the media, and has it been negative or positive? Start with you, Ambassador Hooks.
Well, the way the media is handled, it depends, of course, on the media in question, and of course, whether it's fair depends on is in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. First of all, I think what's been interesting is the international community has, in addition to the African Union and the ECOWAS, I think what has also been very interesting is the fact that the international community has responded very quickly, has reacted very quickly to this election in ways that has not occurred very often in the past. For instance, something again without precedence, where the United Nations, I think, has invalidated the credentials of the representative of President Gbagbo and has accepted the credentials of a representative of President Ouattara. I think this was something rather very unusual, perhaps not entirely without precedent, but very unusual in the United Nations. Now we see some countries who have accepted the representative of President Ouattara as the ambassador, representing Cote d'Ivoire and so forth and so on, international financial institutions as well. So I think we see a reaction on the part of the international community here that is also almost without precedent. But I think that in terms of the situation evolving here, I think that we have a lot of engagement now on the part of the international community looking at Cote d'Ivoire. I think that the attention in many respects is a good thing. I think it's now up to the parties to try to maintain that media attention. As we know, the attention span of the international community tends to be very short. It's as short as the next international crisis, and then the press moves on elsewhere, and then they sort of forget. And I think that's one of the constraints that both parties are acutely aware of, that as long as they've got a lot of attention on the international community, that tends to favor President Ouattara. On the other hand, if that attention is lost, that would then favor President Gbagbo. I think both of them have not been as astute using the press as I think they could have. I think they could have been using Facebook more and Twitter and other things. I think they could have been according interviews with the American press, which I have not seen very much of. I've seen some in the French press, but I have seen almost nothing in terms of the American press. I think particularly Ouattara should understand the importance of that. And even though he's in the Gulf Hotel in Abidjan, these things can be done by teams, television teams, or by telephone interviews and so forth and so on. So I don't think he's used the media as astutely as he perhaps could have. I think President Gbagbo could also, he obviously would be, his views would be of interest, I think, to the press as well. He could perhaps have used the press a bit more. But the press clearly has taken a very clear view of these elections. The local press in Ivory Coast, controlled by the government, of course, has obviously taken a government position, whereas I think the international community, by and large, has, with a few exceptions, has taken a view that this is a case where someone who won the elections has not been allowed to take power. So I think that the media's attention has been there, but it will fade over time unless, of course, unless the situation is really quite dramatic. That attention begins to fade, and as it does, the attention of decision makers, and like you, President Obama, would begin to fade as well.
Thank you.
Well, as a recovering journalist, I have to admit that the American media tends toward good guy, bad guy in situations. We look for the hero and we look for the villain. Right now, Ouattara is the hero, and Gbagbo is considered the villain. And I don't think a clear understanding of the situation, what led to it, you asked me in the first question, how did we get here? I don't think you've seen that in the American media, so people would tend to either think, as Mr. Gbagbo and his supporters say, well, this is the French and the Americans, they're bullying me, they're trying to dominate us. Or if you're President-elect Ouattara, you would say, well, what you hear in the statements by the United States and the UN, that's correct. See, I am the president. I have been surprised that Ouattara has not used the media much at all. I think he seems to feel that the media is doing his work for them, which to a certain extent they are, because again, he's the good guy, he's the hero. President Gbagbo, I have been a little surprised that they haven't been able to come up with this evidence that they say they have of vast rigging and cheating. Having observed elections in Africa and trained observers in Africa, I know that it's not that difficult to show what's wrong. For example, if you're in a district and you have 150,000 registered voters, you shouldn't at the end of the day have 210,000 votes. So if there were these anomalies, why hasn't he been able to show them? So he has used the media, but I don't think it's been as effective because where's the beef? There's been no proof.
You're dating yourself. and before we go to Ambassador Perry, as soon as Ambassador Perry finishes, we're going to go to the audience. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. I think, Stacey, we have microphones. Okay, yeah, so as soon as Ambassador Perry, so what's your assessment on the role of the media? And to my surprise, I try to watch a lot of international business channels at home, and I've not seen much covered from the business side of this controversy.
I don't think there's been that much media attention beyond the focus on the conduct of the elections. In terms of, I think both of you are correct, neither one of them have used the media as effectively as possible. When you step back from looking at a democracy, elections are one part of it, and I think people are more aware now that it's how a country is run after the elections that maybe is more important. And probably there, President Gbagbo has a better story to tell because things do work than he has told. And whatever reason he's missing that, or President Ouattara could point out things that could have been done that have not been done that affect the lives of people. And maybe that's the larger story that we need to look at going forward, not only for Cote d'Ivoire, but also for the whole region because of its important role in terms of transportation links for the whole region.
I think you'll also notice in recent history that the Chinese have avoided taking positions on very sensitive political issues. They're interested much more in economics than in the political side, and as a rule they tend to try to avoid being identified with one political position or the other. This is not only in a broad policy sense, but I can tell you when I was there, and we traveled as the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the Chinese ambassador never wanted to speak, much less take a position. And I think that's also the case in Ivory Coast. So I'm not at all surprised that you have not seen the Chinese. They tend, however, to be very reticent in terms of sanctions, UN intervention, and so forth because of their own political situation. But in terms of African political crises, they try to avoid taking a forward position on any specific issue there, except as a broad principle how it might apply to China.
Okay, yeah, grab a mic, make sure someone with a mic, okay.
Okay, hi. So I'm Maria Sosi from the UN Information Center, and I think this might be a question for Mr. Simpkins mainly, and it's about the UN, because you mentioned possibly no military intervention, but there are thousands of UN peacekeepers. What could they be doing that they're not doing? What other measures might the UN be able to do to help this situation along or to retain the attention of the international community, etc.?
UN peacekeepers have done their job in that there hasn't been the really rampant violence that you see in a number of other countries where you have unrest. But they are, as I understand it, Chapter 6. They're peacekeepers, not peace enforcers, which would be Chapter 7. And in many of these cases, in order to get rid of President Gbagbo to actually take that action, you'd have to change the mandate of the troops that are there, which is going to be a little tricky because now you have to get the Russians and the Chinese to agree to something a lot more aggressive than they agreed to thus far, which is keeping the peace. The other thing is you also have French really well-trained troops, about 900 of them in Cote d'Ivoire. However, given the relationship that France has with Cote d'Ivoire, it would be tricky to allow the French to be a part of that military force that took Gbagbo out. So who else they have in besides the French, not clear. I understand the Pakistanis are there, and
Bangladesh.
and the Bangladesh are there. Very good. They're very good.
Moroccans also.
Yeah. So they would have to undergo a complete change of their mandate in order to do what's being proposed. But they're doing a pretty good job thus far in that they're keeping the peace for the most part.
Okay, over there, Bill Reed.
My,
Identify yourself.
my name is Bill Reed, and I'm from the Black Press International. My picture is getting taken. Thank you. Greg, well, first of all, I speak for the unwashed. Through the end of November, I knew little about this except for from international television, the summary reports. And those reports tend to say that the Western countries support the opposition leader, and he did, in fact, win the election. Greg, you've done a very good job in bringing up to date what has happened there and telling the story that I really didn't know. So can you go a little bit further, because you did indicate your background in this. Where are the numbers? Don't they have computers, and where's the printout?
That's a good question. You know, in 1992, I was working on Angola when they had their historic elections. And leading up to that, to the Angolan elections, Jonas Savimbi of UNITA was told that, I don't have to spell out UNITA, do I?
No, you're okay.
I'm only mentioning them in passing. Savimbi was told that he was going to win. And people were trooping in, talking to him about future deals. Well, he lost the first round to President Dos Santos. He could not accept that he lost. Even though there was going to be a second round, he just couldn't accept it. And he was talking about going back to war. The same is true, I think, with Mr. Gbagbo, who expected he would win. He finished first in the first round, and he thought he would expand his lead. Well, when somebody's convinced that they're going to win, it's very difficult to get them to accept a loss that they just don't anticipate. It's not, nobody around him told him he was going to lose. They probably didn't tell him he had a chance to lose. So when he lost, he must have thought, well, I must be rigged out. There must be rigging. The same thing happened in Angola, in which you should have been able to produce evidence of fraud. In Angola, they didn't, really. I mean, there were reports of rigging, but there wasn't the kind of evidence presented that would convince you that, oh, geez, Savimbi was cheated out of this. Nor has there been the kind of evidence to show that Gbagbo was cheated out of a victory. Now, his people keep saying they have it, but it's been more than a month. Where is it? It's simple enough to show, honestly. It really is. But they haven't shown anything.
Could I have one point on that? The numbers were not really in question. The numbers, of course, were published by each voting booth, each voting office or station. They were tabulated and then sent to Abidjan. Copies were sent to the UN as well as to the Constitutional Court ultimately. So the numbers themselves were not in question. The question was, was there fraud, and therefore should some of those ballots be invalidated? That became the real issue. The numbers are there and have been published, I believe.
Well, if I could also add that a lot of what they're challenging is the citizenship of the people who voted, which is why the Constitutional Commission threw them out so quickly. Frankly, I don't see how they could possibly have checked the citizenship of these people that were challenged so quickly. Now, there's been, as I mentioned before, this avorté was used to prevent the registration of a lot of people in the North. A lot of them didn't have identity cards, so they couldn't get registered in the first place. But now, think of how many times I mentioned that this election has been postponed, 6 times in 5 years. In all that time, couldn't you have certified that the people with identity cards and with voter cards were real Ivorians? If after all of that, now you have to come back and say, oh, wait a minute, there's hundreds of thousands of people who voted who shouldn't have voted, then that's on the government and his government. It's their fault that this happened.
So give a mic to, yeah. Hold on, let's get a mic first. Okay, I'll get you.
Quick question. The only way true peace can ever come about is if there's economic stability. And so, looking back historically, the role of the business community, the multinationals, if pressure is put on the government to behave in a certain manner that makes sense, and then maybe perhaps the investment will come back to the country, it seems to me that, perhaps the role of CCA or Global Sullivan Principle, something like that, could encourage companies to build a coalition, basically saying that they would move back in if the government, there's some sort of type of peace arrangement. You see what I'm saying? To me, it seems like, money doesn't go where it's not protected. It doesn't feel protected in Cote d'Ivoire, but...
Yeah, that's Hope Sullivan from the Leon Sullivan Foundation.
I'll make a brief comment and pass it to Ambassador Hooks. I don't think there has been that much active disinvestment in the last 10 years. And in fact, there has been increased investment in the petroleum and gas sector. The returns are good enough that it makes sense, and as long as you are dealing with an export market. If your business depends upon the local market, then it becomes much more problematic. I don't think there's that much pressure that the business community can apply on willful, stubborn political leaders.
Right, so I'm thinking though, if they begin to pull back, unless there is some fairness in the country, unless they begin to pull back, they're going to continue to get money if there's, you see what I'm saying? I believe that there's a role that the business, that the multinational, the corporate community has to play, and then in terms of training, because there's going to have to be rebuilding at some point. So it just seems like, the discussion of sanctions was just sort of mentioned and passed over, but I think that that's probably going to be the critical issue moving forward.
You have anything to add to that, Ambassador?
Just a couple of comments. As we know, politics takes place in an economic context, and economics takes place in a political context. I think the business sector, they see that there are resources in the Ivory Coast. They're very eager to invest in the country. They've manifested this interest over a long period of time. And I think that one of the probably most active parties in trying to push for elections is always the Ivorian business community. I think that if the political situation today can be resolved, I think we'll see a considerable renewed interest on the part of the business community, because there has been interest expressed in the past. It was sort of, let's wait until elections take place, and then we'll come back in, and it will not come back in, but come in more, let's say, because those that are there, the large companies have not left. Yeah. It'd be a question of new investment coming in, and there is considerable interest in doing that if the political situation stabilizes enough to warrant that.
Well, not one to pass up answering a question from my boss. Let me say that I think it's going to be a very difficult situation that President Ouattara will face, providing he is eventually the one who prevails here, because there's a definite split between the North and the South, between Christians and Muslims. between people of different ethnic groups. And in order to ensure fairness, in order for companies to be truly successful, they have to have some real connection to the community. So I do think, and I may be a little biased, but I do think that some set of standards, the Global Sullivan Principles, as she mentioned, is one, would be useful in cementing the relationship between the community and the businesses that operate there.
Okay, next question.
Derek Langford, I'm an interested observer. I've seen some reports in the media that Gbagbo has been, or there's some speculation that he may be offered asylum in the United States. I wanted to get your opinion. Do you think that's feasible?
Okay. Ambassador Perry, take a stab at that then, Ambassador Hooks.
If the administration thought it would help, I think they would offer him an opportunity to come here. Whether he would be willing to accept, I think, is the major challenge. If the U.S. weren't willing to do it, there are other countries that would, to diffuse the political situation, which would then contribute to stability and increased economic investment.
I think a number of countries have already publicly said they were more than willing to offer him asylum if he wished to go there. Nigeria at one point indicated so, I think Angola has indicated so. But also the Obama administration has also said publicly that this is something that would be looked at if he were to express a desire to come to the United States. But they also quickly noted that so far there has been no expression of interest in doing so. But I think the administration is still open on that particular question. That could change, of course, if things really go wrong in the country, but I think the possibility of that option is probably still on the table, and it's been publicly placed there.
Okay.
I want to know, of the two candidates, which seems to be more sensitive to the plight of women and human rights as it relates to their futures in the country?
Greg, you want to take a stab at that?
Well, under President Gbagbo, I don't think that human rights were observed to the extent that one would expect. So given the fact that Ouattara has not really been president, although he was acting president for 18 months, the last 18 months of President Houphouët-Boigny's life, one would think that given his grounding in the West, that he might be more favorable to the equality of women. But that, again, would remain to be seen.
How about you, Ambassador Hooks? Because President Gbagbo's wife, Simone, she has a very interesting reputation there in the country. And I'll let you take that from there.
Well, I'll address the question that you asked. I think both candidates have maintained that, of course, they are very sensitive to women's rights, so they have offered women the opportunity to be a part of the certainly in President Gbagbo's administration. I think President Ouattara also has many key women around him. Secretary General of his party is a woman, former Minister of Justice. So I think that both would maintain that they were very sensitive to this issue and would back up that claim by saying that key positions in their administrations would be occupied by women. On the human rights issue, of course, I think both would say that they have been or would be respectful of human rights. Obviously, President Gbagbo has been in power during a difficult time and has been accused of human rights violations. President Ouattara, who's very sensitive, I think, to the international community, I think would also be very particularly sensitive to this issue. Thank you.
Okay.
My name is Kenneth Singleton, and I have two really harsh disagreements with Ambassador Greg. One, that the country is divided between Muslims and Christians, and this is a kind of a match between Muslims and Christians. It's not. I've been in Cote d'Ivoire. I lived there about 8 months out of every year, and I've just returned from there. The issue is not a strife between Christians and Muslims at all. Christians and Muslims have coexisted in Cote d'Ivoire for a number of years peacefully, and they continue to exist together peacefully. And as a matter of fact, the first person who ever said that there was a strife between Christians and Muslims is actually Mr. Ouattara. So the second point I want to make in this is also that the issue of Mr. Ouattara and his background concerning human rights and so forth in Cote d'Ivoire, Mr. Ouattara is known as the Père de la Rebellion, the father of the rebellion. And French journalists and French media who have also covered Mr. Ouattara have openly called him the fomenter of coups. So that the 1999 coup and the 2002 coup are considered to be the works of Mr. Ouattara. They've traced money and records and other information and have said conclusively that they have even some government information that shows...
What's your question? Because we kind of short on time.
Following my case, my question is this. The international community has spewed out a lot of talk about this. One, the question of the country's sovereignty has to come into play because during the Gore-Bush elections, no one came in and gave sanctions to President Bush.
Question.
Okay, but that is the question of sovereignty. The second question is why hasn't the international community come back to Cote d'Ivoire and counted the votes with the president? The president of Cote d'Ivoire has asked that the community come in and check the votes and see for themselves.
Okay,
and the third question to that is just simply this. There were 4 international observers who were on the ground, different groups from AU and ECOWAS, who all looked at the election results and said there was massive fraud in the North and all these things.
If there were no strife between North and South, then where did the Civil War come from? There are hundreds of people who are dead today because there was some strife. Now, on the ground, in any country where you have leaders using ethnicity or religion as a tool of division, there are always going to be people who don't respect that. So I didn't say everybody respects that, but it is evident enough in what has happened in Cote d'Ivoire to say that certainly there is some division. Now, in terms of the votes, I think Ambassador Hook said it isn't so much the counting of ballots that was the issue, but rather whether the people who cast them were all legitimately Ivorian when they cast those ballots. I don't think that the international community has the capacity to come in and determine whether you're Ivorian or not. That was up to President Gbagbo's administration, which took 5 years to put this election together to certify that that didn't happen.
Okay, final question.
Yes, my name is Yaya Fanusia. I'm the Director of Special Operations for USA, for US-Africa Coalition 2017. There will be United States of Africa. Very simple. Mr. Gbagbo better step down, or he is going to end up like that is Canada of Guinea.
So I'm going to give each panelist 60 seconds to give a summary remark, and then we're going to begin to wrap up the program. Ambassador Hooks.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel today. And I'd like to thank you for coming today. I wish I could have met with you when I was ambassador in Ivory Coast. I was always looking for a constituency to raise issues of Ivory Coast, so it's very good to see you here today. I think that what we see in the elections is symptomatic of moral problems in Ivory Coast. Elections don't just happen in isolation, but they represent problems within, or the political situation within the country. And I think that the issues that we see today have sort of come to the fore in this election. This election should have been a mechanism to start the process of reconciliation and to move the country toward questions of legitimacy, lifting of sanctions, and opening up the possibility of Ivory Coast taking the place that it used to occupy many years ago when it was in the right column of all that was good in Africa. Unfortunately, now it is seen as representative of some of the difficulties in Africa. But I would like to see it move back into the column where it represents what is good in Africa, and I think it can. And I think that's one of the disappointments of the electoral process. That does not mean, however, that ultimately this issue cannot be resolved in a peaceful way, that will put it back there. But I think these elections are therefore very, very important. Secondly, I would like to say that I have been impressed with the reaction of, as I mentioned earlier, the African Union, ECOWAS, but also the national community. I'm happy to see that the international community is very interested in what's happening in Ivory Coast, regarded as important, and is following it, because I think it is important to the stability of Africa, and therefore stability to the world in that sense. So I think that shows how important Ivory Coast is. I have to say that I remain optimistic. I was optimistic when I left there in 2007. I travel there frequently now. I was just there late November, late October, early November. And I remain optimistic about Ivory Coast. I think this issue is going to be resolved, and I think Ivory Coast will move in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank the sponsors of this event. Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for being here and for asking some very interesting questions. I think we need to stay focused on this very important country, not only to West Africa, not only to Africa generally, but to the international community. I think we've seen a number of developments that I consider very positive, in that there's a new way of dealing with tough electoral situations that we haven't seen much of in the past. I think that the whole idea of Africans holding one another accountable is a very progressive move, and I also think that the African diplomacy that's been applied in this situation is very welcome to see. I think we all have to be rather patient. I think we have to give whatever government results from this all of the assistance that we can, but I think that eventually this will be resolved positively.
Thanks, Ambassador Perry.
I'd like to thank the Society of International Development for reaching out to CCA to partner on this event, and to all of you for turning out today. In terms of Cote d'Ivoire, I think we've seen remarkable diplomacy from ECOWAS in terms of various tools they've used, the interests of African leaders in helping with negotiation and mediation, and the support they've had from the Western world and the UN as an institution. Also, a lot has happened in basically 4 weeks in terms of coordination. Going forward, because of the egos of people involved and key players and a sense of face and maintaining that, is going to require some careful mediation from other African leaders to work out a solution here. And again, because of Cote d'Ivoire's importance to the region and the transportation links, a lot of them have a stake in this turning out successfully. So I think it will keep their interests focused on a peaceful solution, and I'm optimistic.
Thank you, Ambassador Perry. Why don't you all give our panelists a great big hand here. Ambassador Hooks, Greg Simpkins, and Ambassador Perry. And in closing, I want to thank CCA for partnering with SID, and Christy and Stacy. Thank you guys again for so much for working to make this happen, because without you two, this wouldn't happen. And finally, how many of you all are familiar with Winston Churchill? Okay. He and I had breakfast this morning, and here's one of the things he told me. To every man there comes a time in his life when he is figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a great and mighty thing, unique to him and fitted to his talents. What a tragedy if that moment finds him unprepared or unqualified for the moment that could be his finest hour. I think President Ouattara, President Gbagbo both have been tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do something great and mighty and unique to them and fitted to their talents. What a tragedy if either one of them are unprepared or unqualified for the moment that could be their finest hour. Turn it back over to Christy Reagan.
Well, I think we should applaud this fabulous panel under the leadership of President Obama. He didn't just talk about Cote d'Ivoire, but took us right inside Cote d'Ivoire.